Hello, Mr. Daniels. Thank you for accepting our interview. And it is very useful to have you here to hear your voice and your opinion for the SEANERGY project. I will ask you mainly 3 questions. My first question is, what do you think are the main drivers for energy transition in ports? You can select between A, regulatory pressure, B, economic benefits, C, environmental concerns, D, reputation and branding, E, technological development, or F, other, and you can describe it.
Fantastic. Thanks. It's a great question, and I'm happy to be here and happy to answer. Those are all, and I love multiple choice questions. They make my job so easy. But I think in this case, the answers are it's all of the above, right? Of course, it's all of the above. Decarbonization in ports is not a port problem. Decarbonization is a societal problem and a global problem, as we all recognize. And so the port aspect of it is not an issue that's restricted to ports. It's an important issue for ports, but it's also an important issue for other sectors. And it's not just a single country or a region. It's not a European problem. It's not a North American problem. It's a global problem. So how do we address the whole problem? Well, it's not a port problem. It's not a transportation problem. It's not a maritime problem. It's an energy problem. Mm-hmm. And a climate problem, and ports is one aspect of that. So that's where I come from this. I don't come at it from a port perspective. I come at it from a systems perspective and a global perspective. So the port aspect of it isn't the way I look at it isn't how do we decarbonize ports or even how do we decarbonize shipping. It's how do we decarbonize the economy. Mm-hmm. And when you look at it that way, it becomes scarier and harder to do from the standpoint of the ports because the ports don't control the economy, obviously. A ship owner owns the ship and nothing more. They can't control anything beyond those boundaries. The port can control what happens in the port, but they have limited control over what happens just outside the port. The municipal authorities might own what's outside the port or be able to control that, but they have less control as you get further inside the port, and then once ships leave the port, they lose control. So everyone has overlapping responsibilities and levels of authority, and yet the problem is global and society-wide and economy-wide. So on the one hand, that's very intimidating and very hard to, who controls that, who has a responsibility. But I like to look at it the other way around, which is to say it opens up the opportunities to find solutions that also don't restrict themselves just to a ship. It's not just about the shipping fuel. Mm-hmm. It's not just about the ports or the port operations. And this is where you get things like the concept of a port as an energy hub. Can the port serve its own needs and those of the surrounding community? Can the port serve as a landing place for offshore energy? Can it be a hub of energy transformation? And of course the answer is yes to all of those things. What else could it do? Could the port support decarbonization of the transport sector outside the port? Mm-hmm. Can it help long-haul trucking? There's no reason it couldn't. If it's an energy hub, it could also be the source of energy for other sectors. What about the industrial sector? There's already a close collaboration and cooperation, always has been, between ports and the industrial sector. What about in a green future when the forms of energy may change? Will those relationships change? I think the answer is almost certainly yes. How will they change? No one knows. Those are the fun questions. So I think it's a good challenge, decarbonizing ports, but it also leads to some really interesting opportunities, and I'm interested in exploring those opportunities, outside the port themselves.
Thank you very much. Moving to my second question. Which role do you think technology can play in facilitating energy transition in ports?
Of course, technology is key, of course, right? Sine qua non, right? If you don't have the technology, you obviously can't can't decarbonize. The question is which technology? It's always the question. Where do we put, into which basket do we put our eggs? Do we cover multiple baskets? Do we pick one? Governments for a very, very long time have a long standing tradition of never picking the right technology winner. And so how do you manage that? But at the same time, if you spread yourselves too thin, there's only a limited amount of capital. If we try to develop all technologies, that's not a very good use of society's resources. So there's a little bit of a conundrum there, but clearly technology innovation is necessary. Usually the answer is you rely on the private sector to develop the technological solutions, and I'm a firm believer in the innovative capability of the private sector to develop these things. Of course, they'll need help, but the help is maybe one of removing barriers rather than one of pushing particular solutions.
Okay, thank you. My third and last question, if you want to explain to us a bit what is your role, what is your area of expertise, and if you want to cite any success story in your expertise area.
Well, my background is actually energy modeling. It's not maritime particularly. Maritime is a component of it, but really I come at it from a broad energy system perspective. My background is mostly, I'm American, as you can tell from my accent, and I have a lot of experience in the U.S. government, sort of seeing things from that perspective. I've been in Europe now for about 3 years. I work in Sweden for Sweden's Road and Transport Research Institute. So I'm focused, organizationally, we focus on the transport sector, but in Sweden, in particular, in Europe in general, a very innovative place in terms of the development of the energy sector and the transport sector. So I am very interested in that interplay, the overlap between the energy sector and the transport sector. And I'm happy to be in a place like VTI that allows me to explore that intersection. So success stories, from my perspective, is probably more around transitions. As we look at different transitions, and I think, I'm afraid of citing any specific transitions, but I think what's helpful in this area is to look at transitions that have happened in other types of transitions and in adjacent industries and adjacent sectors, and then I would keep going further and further out. So if we don't restrict ourselves to, ports and shipping, we go into other areas of transport and the transportation of goods on the roads. And then I would go beyond that and look at the transportation of people on the roads. And I would go beyond that to the transportation of, goods through other means. So success stories, I would look at the electrification of personal vehicles, actually. It's several degrees of away from shipping, because it's not goods and it's not maritime, but it is movement of things. In this case, it's people, and it's in vehicles. And there was a lot of work and studies in that sector about how you decarbonize that. There were a lot of ideas. If you look at the way that Norway has handled it, it was through a lot of subsidies, and that does work. And I think nobody ever questioned whether that would work. What they would question was whether that model was replicable other places. What I've seen now anecdotally is that their neighbor, Sweden, which hasn't had nearly the same level of subsidies that Norway has had, has essentially organically adopted electric vehicles, or is beginning to adopt electric vehicles in their personal vehicle fleet. Without the levels of subsidies that Norway had. Okay. And that's really interesting. What has driven that? The conventional wisdom was that, people don't want these things. There's all kinds of reasons not to get an electric vehicle. They're too expensive. They don't go far. They don't perform well in the winter. All these things. And yet, the Swedish people are buying electric vehicles. Why? And I don't have a very good answer to that question, actually. But it's my example of being careful of the conventional wisdom. If you look at transforming the maritime industry, there's a lot of barriers to transforming it. There are technical barriers, there are regulatory barriers, there are organizational barriers, there are business model barriers, there are all kinds of barriers. But once the system starts transforming, it can start transforming quickly and kind of against all expectations, like Sweden has done with electric vehicles, for instance. So I would look for opportunities and indicators where things might start changing in the maritime sector and going after that, rather than looking at this as a big challenge and trying to figure out how do we push forward and push through this challenge. Look for places where the challenge is being overcome, find those solutions and encourage them. It takes a little bit of humility to recognize that maybe we don't have the right solutions and we have to let those solutions bubble up organically and then join them. But that might be the right way to do it.
Okay. I really thank you very much.
Happy to be here.
I have no other questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure, absolutely. That was helpful.